Hello, and welcome to the Don Mills Trail, a linear park in the Don Mills neighborhood in Toronto. Come along with me, let's go for a walk on the trail and cover over a century of history along the way. I'm at the south end of the Don Mills Trail. This is a rail trail, and we'll be going over some of the railroad history involved throughout the course of this video. Behind me, you see a fence. This is officially a dead end. It won't be forever, we'll get to that in a moment. But as you can see, somebody's cut a hole in the fence. And in this picture taken from just beyond there, you can see some railroad ties. And if you look closely on the left and the right, you'll see some infrastructure that's still in place. Less than 100 meters behind me is CP's main line, known as the Belleville subdivision, that heads east out of the city, as the name implies, towards Belleville and points east. To the west of where I'm standing used to be the Inn on the Park, constructed starting in the early 1960s. That area has been redeveloped and it's now home to a couple of car dealerships and some condos. And over to the east was the former IBM head office and manufacturing facility built in the early 1950s. After IBM moved out, Celestica took over, and then Celestica sold the property. It's now being redeveloped into a mixed-use development, a lot of townhouses and condos, along with some employment and retail. And once that's done, the city is going to build a bridge over the railroad tracks, which run diagonally across there, connecting up to this trail. Other than that, the only way out from this end of the trail at the moment is some unofficial ways that have been blazed through private property on the various sides. And we'll see some other examples of that as we go up the trail. All right, let's head north and we'll talk about some railroad history as we go. This rail trail is built on the route of what was known as the Leaside Spur, even though none of it is actually in Leaside. It was built by the Canadian Northern Railway in 1917 to allow service through Leaside to the Canadian Pacific Railway's North Toronto station, seen in this photo. The Canadian Northern built a set of shops in Leaside which opened in 1919 and were accessed from their main line via this spur and the CP line. The locomotive servicing building from those shops still remains and is currently occupied by Longo's Supermarket. The owners of the Canadian Northern also developed much of Leaside itself. Along the CP line through Leaside was also the Leaside Station, which closed in the early 1980s and was demolished earlier this year to make way for the maintenance and storage facility for the Eglinton Crosstown LRT line. Along this part of the trail, it's mostly commercial buildings on either side. And you can see one of them behind me. And down here you can see there's a trail that people have made off into the bush. And just down there is the only remaining railroad track that I'm aware of along this former section. Obviously it's not connected to anything anymore, but that would have been a siding servicing that building. All right, as we continue heading north, the buildings on either side become more residential in nature. So let's have a look at that. While this spur was built to allow the Canadian Northern to offer service to the North Toronto station, that never actually happened. The Canadian Northern was in financial difficulty and was taken over by the federal government, as were several other troubled railroads at about the same time. These were eventually merged to form the Canadian National Railway. For that matter, CP's North Toronto station, which we saw earlier, didn't last much longer. It was only in use for about a decade and a half. With the opening of the current Union Station in downtown Toronto in 1927, and the effects of the Great Depression, traffic to North Toronto Station declined. The building is now home to a liquor store. And here we are approaching the first official access point to the southern end of the trail. The city has helpfully put up a sign, warning of the dead end. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the googly eyes are not official, but I do think they're a nice touch. In this section here, In the middle of the trail, where it meets the paths off to the neighborhoods on either side, the city has embedded rails in the paving stones as a symbol of the origins of this trail. Over to the west, that street is Overland Drive. To the east, also Overland Drive, even though they do not connect. And to the north, let's keep going and we'll head towards Lawrence Avenue. And here we are approaching Lawrence Avenue, a major east-west thoroughfare in the city. As you can see here, we have another set of rails embedded in the paving stones. And now we're going to wait to cross the intersection. And while we're waiting, let's go over some more history. CN continued to use the Leaside Spur until 1999, when they abandoned it. It was bought by the City of Toronto in 2001. City government moved slowly, and it took about a decade until the section from the south end up to Bond Avenue was opened as a public trail. As we head north of Lawrence, it starts to get darker on the path as the tree canopy encloses the path more and there's less of the sky visible. And we're continuing now towards Talwood Drive. And here off to the side of the trail, we have an example of one of the numerous makeshift entrances and exits to the trail. Here somebody obviously wants to be able to access it from their backyard. There are a number of these up along the length of the trail. And here we are at Talwood Drive. There's a third spot here with rails embedded in the paving. And up there off to the west is a water tower. All right, let's keep heading north. And here we are at Bond Avenue, where the old rail line passed over this section on this bridge. The bridge abutments date back to 1912, even though the line itself was not constructed until a few years later. Apparently that was standard practice in the day. In 2011, the city almost demolished this because of the deterioration of the bridge abutments, but it was saved by an outcry from the citizens, and the bridge was incorporated into the path. Now let's head back up to the path and keep going north. When the Don Mills Trail first opened, it ended here at Bond Avenue. The northern section we're about to cover opened in 2017, completing the trail. From here, we're back to mostly commercial buildings on the west side. On the east side is Bond Park. The bend in the path you see behind me is the point at which the Leaside Spur joined the main line. And you can barely see it through here, but you may be able to see just right there some railroad tracks. That was the Canadian Northern Railway main line, built in 1906. And after the government took over Canadian Northern Railway, that became part of CN's main line. CN called it the Bala subdivision. In 2012, Metrolinx, the provincial mass transit authority for the Greater Toronto Area, purchased this portion of the Bala subdivision for use for it, and it's now almost exclusively used by GO trains on the Richmond Hill line. It's also used by Via Rails the Canadian heading eastbound coming into Toronto. And the rest of the path up this way to the north is just a brand new path that the city constructed. So let's head up to the north end of the path, which is not that far ahead. As we head up the trail, let's have a look at some other sites along the way. Just in case you didn't get a good enough look at the railroad track in the last segment, here's a better view from an area with less vegetation in the way. There's also a siding a bit further north with some railroad right-of-way maintenance equipment on it. There's plenty of wildlife along the trail, including lots of squirrels, and this bunny. As we reach the northern end of the trail, everything changes. We say goodbye to the rail line here on our east. This heads up to Oriole Go Station, about 1.5 kilometers north of here, and then continues on north. And we take a sharp turn to the west under York Mills Road above us and towards Leslie Street. And as we emerge from under York Mills and approach the end of the trail, I checked the elevation on GPS at the starting point and just down there before we started climbing this little hill. So that was about the same as what the railroad line is. And it's within the error reading of GPS. So essentially, over almost 4 kilometers of trail, there is no elevation change, which is pretty typical for rail trails. It's because railroads don't like elevation changes. They can only work with slopes typically up to about 1 or 2%. They're generally very flat, and this one is no exception. And now here we are at the end of the trail. Right behind me, this is Scarsdale Road. That major street there is York Mills, and Leslie Street is just a block that way. So there you go. That's the end of our trip through the Don Mills Trail. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you learned a few things, and perhaps I'll see you here someday.